Support comes from Goethe Pop-Up Seattle, presenting 55 Voices for Democracy, a podcast that brings together conversations with intellectuals, artists, and activists. Inspired by Thomas Mann's speeches produced for the BBC during the rise of fascism in Europe. Available on Apple Podcast and Spotify.
Hey, it's Patricia Murphy. It's Thursday, and this is Seattle Now. Pods, or bubbles, have enabled people to stay connected during the pandemic. But for them to work, everyone involved needs to be clear about their behavior and risk-taking. In a minute, The Atlantic's Rachel Gutman explains how we can do it more safely. But first, let's get you caught up. Working in an Amazon fulfillment center is hazardous, and now the Seattle Times reports Washington State's Department of Labor and Industries is boosting workers' comp premium rates for those employees by 15% starting next year. Prior investigative reporting revealed that Amazon's fulfillment center in DuPont had a serious injury rate, more than 4 times the industry average last year. Some grocery distributors and recycling facilities argued that higher injury rates at Amazon centers were driving up premiums for the entire industry. Democratic Congresswoman Susan DelBene was unanimously elected as chair of the new Democrat coalition. It's made up of moderate members of the House who represent purple districts and want to maintain their Democratic majority. DelBene's first congressional district includes Redmond and runs north to the Canadian border. DelBene takes over from Derek Kilmer, another Washingtonian representing the 6th district. And some good news. Coronavirus vaccines could be distributed in Washington state within days. The National Guard is standing by to assist, and Seattle-based Alaska Airlines says they're also prepared to step in to help distribute. The vaccine rollout is expected to take several months. One of the ways we've found to cope with the ongoing pandemic is finding our pod. You know, pairing up with another family or relatives for social reasons. You could build a pod or bubble to homeschool the kids. There are work pods, even study pods. The winter weather is making these kinds of arrangements even more desirable to stave off isolation. But as Rachel Gutman, a deputy managing editor at The Atlantic, has been finding out, pod members need to be on the same page or they risk doing more harm than good. Oh, and by the way, we had a few trains passing by while we were taping. Hey, Rachel, thanks for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me.
So a lot of people I know have been fairly comfortable moving inside their pods, but as you point out, there is an issue with this. What is wrong with having a pod?
Having a pod is necessarily going to be a little bit riskier than staying inside your home and never leaving, but as we have all learned over the last 8 months, staying inside your home and never leaving is not an option for everybody all the time. And so pods are good in that they allow people a little bit more flexibility. Where pods can get a little bit more troublesome is where the people who are in the pod maybe aren't all on the same terms, or people who aren't even in the same pods might think that they're talking about the same thing and be talking about something entirely different. And so the way that this becomes a little bit more concerning is when people have a false sense of security, thinking that I'm in a pod, I'm safe.
Right. And you saw this in action. You talked to a bunch of people about their pods. Can you give me an example you came across that illustrates some of the problems you're talking about here?
Just to illustrate kind of the diversity of pods that I did find, I found everything from one man who lives in the Cleveland suburbs who is in a pod just with his mother and his uncle. They don't see anybody else inside unmasked. I found a family in Seattle who they considered their nanny to be part of their household. So, for example, the nanny goes home to her family every night, but there's not a lot of talk about who's doing what after everybody goes home. And then there was a group of 7 adults living in one home, which has got to be a really challenging situation during the pandemic. They have what they call a pod, but they're not necessarily tracing their endpoints. So they're more limiting the number of people that each of them can see, but they don't necessarily know where those chains of contact end.
So if you're in a pod or a bubble, communication is key. But here in the U.S., there has been an absence of clear public health messaging around this. Where can we look to in the world that is giving their citizens explicit guidance on pods?
So Pods should work to flatten the curve compared to everybody just going about their daily lives as they would before there's a pandemic. And in New Zealand is kind of credited with being the force that popularized pods for the world, and it was actually originally developed for disabled folks because all of us depend on other people to a certain extent, but especially for folks who may not be able to get out of bed by themselves or things like that, you really need other people in your home. And it really caught on there. The government kind of picked up on this idea really quickly. As early as March 24th, the Prime Minister of New Zealand, Jacinda Ardern, was using the word bubble in a press conference, and then I think quickly after that, the Ministry of Health incorporated the word into its official alert level guidance. So they have 4 alert levels from pretty much everything's okay up to lockdown, and the 3rd and 4th levels have explicit guidance about what you should be doing with your bubble.
Okay, so just looking at figures here, New Zealand is a stark contrast to the U.S. in terms of effective virus control. In just the past 24 hours, that country has had 1 new case of COVID. Here in the U.S., for comparison, 180,000 new cases and more than 2,500 deaths during that same 24 hours. That's breathtaking. Do we need to take this into our own hands and come up with our own COVID guidelines and agreements?
Yeah, absolutely. And a bunch of the people who I spoke with did exactly that. One of the people who I spoke with is a nanny, and they had written into their contract for nannying, this is what we are doing about the pandemic. These are our rules for our pod. I also talked to somebody who lives in a house with 6 other people, and they use a Google Doc. They have a list of guidelines that they adhere to. It's a document that can change over time. They have weekly meetings to assess how they're doing and whether they need to change anything. In that community, people had realized that there really weren't very many official resources and decided that they needed to come up with best practices on their own.
And this also can help with decision fatigue, because the more decisions and rules and guidelines that you have in place for your pod, the fewer nuances that are going to come up that you're going to have to make decisions on on the fly.
Absolutely. And it's impossible to prepare for every single situation. And at some point, you're going to just be in a particular circumstance that you didn't expect and have to make a decision and think about how your pod would want to handle it. But making those kinds of agreements or guidelines when you're first setting out, or even if you're not first setting out, even if you've already had a pod going, taking the time to do that helps you know a little bit more about what level of risk you're willing to accept and what level of risk the people in a pod with you are willing to accept, so that you can make more informed decisions when you do have to make them on the fly.
To further your point, communication is critical when you're forming a pod with each other. The rules need to be very clear, which is interesting because communication is not a strong Pacific Northwest trait. We are a very passive-aggressive culture here. Direct communication about thorny issues, very, very difficult for us. How should people here think about this? Because what I keep coming back to as I was reading your article is that old adage about sex. If you're not old enough and mature enough to have that conversation about sex, maybe you're not old enough or mature enough to have sex. I feel like this might be bleeding into the pandemic pod scenario.
That's actually really funny that you say that, because in talking with these public health experts and epidemiologists about how do you talk about these things, when I tried to ask, is there anything that this reminds you of or past things that we can compare it to, everybody talked about STIs. Similarly to when you're in health class in middle school or high school and they teach you that if you have unprotected sex, it's like you're having sex with everybody who your partner has ever had sex with. Similarly, if your bubble is not closed, it's like you are in a room unmasked with everybody who the people in your bubble have been in a room unmasked with.
Is it an ignorance is bliss situation? I'm not sure. Like, do we just not want to know the answer? Maybe.
I don't know, because one of the epidemiologists who I spoke to had a really great point that throughout the pandemic, we have been having to kind of renegotiate every single interaction that we have with other people. And if we're not actively renegotiating, we are in our heads being really anxious about the fact that we're not actively negotiating it. I think that that's probably something everybody has experienced. The advantage of a pod with respect to decision fatigue and negotiation fatigue is that if you have that one tough conversation right at the beginning, or you have hopefully slightly less tough conversations once a week or once a month or whatever it is that you work out with the folks who are in your pod, you remove that negotiation from all the interactions that you have in the middle. So you're not having to put in that mental effort every single time you see people.
Yeah, and as you point out in your reporting, word choice really matters here. The difference between a pod and a bubble. There's a nuance there that's pretty important.
One of the experts who I spoke to pointed out that she prefers bubble to pod because people have a better idea of what a bubble is. When everybody says bubble, they're mostly referring to the same thing. It's a discrete object. It has an inside and an outside. It's round. It's a sphere. You can pop it. We all kind of know what it is. Pod is a little bit more ambiguous. You have Tide Pods. You have whale pods. Yes,
Orca pods.
Exactly. There's all kinds of different pods. And so this isn't to say that people shouldn't be using the word pod, but to illustrate that we think we know what we're talking about. We think we're speaking the same language, but really people could have totally different ideas in their head.
Yeah. We're all just trying to navigate this risk. Really appreciate your time, Rachel. Thanks for your reporting. Rachel Gutman is a deputy managing editor at The Atlantic. Thank you.
Thank you.
Seattle Now is produced by Sophie Reed, Clare McGrane, Matt Martin, Caroline Chamberlain Gomez, and Jason Pagano. Matt Jorgensen does our music. I'm Patricia Murphy. See you tomorrow.